At the edge of the known world, a young king stands before an army that should not exist. He is outnumbered, far from home, facing an empire that has crushed nations for centuries. He is barely in his 20s, and yet he raises his spear as if the outcome is already decided. Some men conquer because they must. Alexander of Macedon conquered because he believed the world was waiting for him. The Macedonian army did not begin as a force of destiny. It was forged in uncertainty by Alexander's father, Philip II, a man who understood that Greece's endless rivalries had made his armies predictable. Philip watched, learned, and then broke every rule. He transformed Macedon from a backwater kingdom into a military laboratory, experimenting with weapons, formations, and discipline while the rest of Greece clung to tradition. The result was revolutionary. The Macedonian phalanx was not the slow, rigid wall of shields used by earlier Greek armies. It was deeper, denser, and armed with a sarissa pike so long it turned the battlefield into a forest of spear points. 5 ranks of soldiers could strike the enemy before the enemy could even get close enough to strike back. Against it, traditional infantry formations simply unraveled. But the phalanx was only the anvil. The hammer was the cavalry. Macedon's companion cavalry was elite, fast, and terrifyingly precise. While the phalanx fixed the enemy in place, pinning them down, Alexander would personally lead cavalry charges into weak points, shattering formations at exactly the right moment. It wasn't brute force, it was orchestration. Infantry, cavalry, skirmishers, and archers all working as parts of a single, coordinated system. In an age when most armies fought as separate pieces, Alexander's army moved like it had one mind. Alexander inherited this incredible military machine at just 20 years old, and almost immediately, Greece rebelled. The powerful city of Thebes resisted, believing the young king was weak and inexperienced. Alexander answered with shocking speed and ruthlessness. He marched his army south and completely destroyed the city, its terrible fate serving as a stark warning to anyone else who might challenge him. Greece fell silent not because it loved Alexander, but because it feared him. Then, he turned east. Crossing into Asia Minor, Alexander faced the Persian Empire, the greatest superpower the world had ever known. Persia had unimaginable wealth, endless manpower, and centuries of dominance. What it didn't have was Alexander's army or Alexander himself. At the Battle of the Granicus River, in his very first major confrontation with the Persians, Alexander charged directly into their forces, nearly dying in the chaos. A heavy blow meant for his head shattered his helmet. He survived by inches. Lesser commanders might have learned caution from such a close call. Alexander learned confidence. He became convinced he was protected by destiny, and his army began to believe it too. That belief became a weapon in itself. At the Battle of Issus, Alexander faced a Persian army far larger than his own, led by King Darius III himself. The battlefield was cramped and narrow, which negated Persia's numerical advantage. The Macedonian phalanx held the line, an unbreakable wall of spears. Then, Alexander led a decisive cavalry charge straight toward Darius. The Persian king panicked and fled. His armies saw their leader escape and collapsed into chaos. In a single afternoon, the illusion of Persian invincibility was shattered. What followed was as much a psychological war as a military one. Cities saw what was coming and opened their gates before Alexander even arrived. Others resisted and paid a terrible price. Siege warfare tested the Macedonian army in new ways. At Tyre, a heavily fortified city stayed on an island, protected by the sea. Alexander did the unthinkable. He ordered his men to build a massive causeway, a land bridge, across the water to the city walls. It took months. Men died from disease and enemy attacks. The army grumbled. But when Tyre finally fell, the message to the world was clear. No wall could stop them, not on land, and not even at sea. The Macedonian army marched on, through Egypt, where Alexander was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule and declared a god by the priests. And then, he pushed deeper into the heart of Persia itself. At Gaugamela, Darius assembled an army so vast it should have erased Alexander from history. He had chariots with scythes on their wheels, war elephants, and an open plain chosen specifically to overwhelm the Macedonian formation. Alexander adjusted. He weakened his own center to bait the Persians into charging forward, then struck at the exact moment a gap appeared in their lines. It was a gamble bordering on madness, and it worked. Once again, Darius fled the battlefield. The Persian Empire fell not with a final, glorious stand, but with a simple realization: Alexander could not be outfought or outhawed. But the army kept going, into Central Asia, into brutal mountains and scorching deserts that devoured supply lines and crushed morale. Here, the grand battles were replaced by grueling guerrilla warfare. Soldiers married local women. Cultures began to blend. The army was changing and it was straining under the pressure. Then came India, at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. Alexander faced King Porus and his war elephants, towering beasts armored and armed. Unlike anything the Macedonians had ever seen, the horses panicked, men were crushed underfoot, and yet their discipline held. The phalanx adapted its formation to channel the elephants. The cavalry maneuvered around them. Alexander won, but at a tremendous cost, and for the first time, his army said no. Exhausted, homesick, and battered by years of constant war, the Macedonian soldiers refused to march farther east. Alexander raged. He pleaded. He even isolated himself in his tent, waiting for their loyalty to overpower their fear and exhaustion. It didn't. The army that had followed him to the very edge of the world had finally reached its own edge. They turned back. The return journey was brutal. A disastrous crossing of the Jadrajan Desert killed more men than many of their battles ever had. By the time they reached Babylon, the Macedonian army was a shadow of its former self, but still legendary. Then Alexander died suddenly, at just 32 years old. He left no clear heir, no unifying force to hold his vast empire together. The army fractured as his generals immediately began fighting over the pieces. The incredible machine that had conquered the world could not survive without the mind that had guided it. Kingdoms rose from the ruins, but the unity was gone forever. And yet, the legacy endured. The Macedonian army changed warfare forever. The concept of combined arms, tactical flexibility, and professional command structures all became standard. Even Rome would later borrow heavily from Macedonian ideas, sometimes by studying them, and sometimes by defeating their successors. Alexander's army did more than conquer territory. It carried language, ideas, and culture across continents. Greek thought spread east. Eastern influence flowed west. The world became larger and smaller, all because of those soldiers who marched behind a king who refused to see limits. In the end, the Macedonian army was not unstoppable because it was perfect. It was unstoppable because it evolved. It adapted. It followed a leader who treated battle like a living puzzle and believed the impossible was simply the unexplored. And somewhere across the ancient plains where those long sarissas once glittered in the sun, history still remembers the moment a small kingdom dared to challenge the world and won. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories from history. See you next time.